Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Gabriella grew up in an orphanage and hopes for a new life after graduation, but soon faces the harsh reality. Falling into the hands of a wealthy husband with a dark secret, she discovers a terrifying photograph that reveals the secrets of the past. Gabriella stared in amazement at what she found in her husband's suitcase. It was so strange and frightening that she could hardly believe it was real. In that moment, Gabriella realized she would never return here again. All her life, all these nearly 25 years she had been Tobias's wife, now seemed unnatural, terrifying, and even repulsive. Where had her eyes been before? Her husband had managed to scare her, turn her into a weak, powerless being. It was as if she had been asleep all these years. And she had endured, considered everything happening to her almost normal. She had thought she would disappear in this life without him, break down. After all, he was so strong and influential. He was her savior. But today's discovery in the suitcase. Gabriella still didn't fully understand what it all meant, but she sensed that there was some terrifying story behind it, and she no longer wanted to be a part of it. Gabriella had grown up in an orphanage, arriving there at about 2 weeks old. Naturally, she couldn't remember what had happened before that. Her parents were never found. So, she didn't know her mother or father. But like all such orphans, she imagined them to be good and decent people. Something had forced them to leave their daughter in the orphanage temporarily, but they would surely come for her. As soon as they could, as soon as they managed to overcome those insurmountable circumstances. The older Gabriella became, the clearer it became that the long-awaited meeting was unlikely to ever happen. And so it was. At 18, Gabriella graduated from the orphanage with a sewing profession. All the girls from their orphanage were sent to that college. Gabriella wasn't particularly good at it, to be honest. Her hands didn't cooperate, and the threads always got tangled. How could she be a seamstress? She wanted to become an economist. Now that was something she really liked, something that attracted her. She even helped the local accountant with reports. The numbers were so clear, so obedient, and predictable. But who would deal with an orphan girl? She went to study at the same place as the other girls. Once outside the walls of her orphanage, Gabriella was lost. Yes, life there hadn't been easy. The caretakers weren't exactly kind, and the other children could be quite cruel. It followed the law of the pack. If you weren't a predator, you were prey. Gabriella, with her quiet, calm nature, definitely couldn't be a predator. So, from an early age, she had to endure the bullying and mocking of the stronger children. She even got used to it, learned how to interact with her tormentors in a way that would get her less attention, remain unnoticed, not argue, stay obedient. But still, the orphanage was familiar, and everything there was predictable. But the freedom that fell on Gabriella's fragile shoulders was overwhelming. She had no idea what to do with it. Gabriella lived in a small apartment, inherited after her graduation. It was a tiny room with old creaky floors, cracked window frames, everything needed repair. But Gabriella, working as a cleaner in the local supermarket, barely made ends meet. There was no question of repairs. She was just trying to live from paycheck to paycheck. Yet, she loved her apartment. It was her place of strength and calm. Here, she hid from life's hardships and troubles. Here, she felt safe and almost happy. Gabriella was lonely and aware of it. No real friends, no family. She felt vulnerable and defenseless. Her greatest dream was to find her person. And one day, that person appeared in her life. Sebastian was 5 years older, grew up in a big family in a village, and came to the city to study. He quickly dropped out of college and started working as a dispatcher at a bread factory. Most of his earnings went to renting a room. But Sebastian didn't get discouraged. He was a cheerful and carefree person. And this lighthearted mood spread to everyone around him, including Gabriella. They met in that same supermarket where Gabriella was cleaning the floors. Sebastian often appeared in the mornings, bringing goods from the bread factory. Gabriella often caught him looking at her. But the girl didn't think anything would come of it. Who would want her? A quiet, modest cleaner, an orphan from the orphanage. Gabriella didn't think much of herself at that time, and her future seemed bleak. But one day, Sebastian approached her, helped carry a heavy bucket, and asked her something. Gabriella looked into his bright blue eyes, admired his slightly wavy hair, and felt, for what seemed like the first time in her life, a strong feeling called love. She hadn't experienced this in the orphanage, though many of her peers were constantly falling in and out of love with various boys. And not only with boys their age, but also with teachers and other staff members. Gabriella didn't understand them back then, but now she did. Later, Sebastian smiled at her, invited her to dinner that very evening. They walked around the city, talked, got to know each other, and it was clear immediately that they wouldn't be able to live without each other. Soon Sebastian moved in with her. Gabriella finally felt happy, confident, and safe. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a loving, wonderful man who was willing to do anything for her. He worked a lot, not only at the bread factory but also took night shifts occasionally. Now they had enough money for food, and even for inexpensive but new and beautiful clothes from the market. Sebastian tried not to deny his girlfriend anything. Gabriella didn't ask for much. She thought they were living quite well and didn't need anything in particular. But Sebastian dreamed of a more beautiful and carefree life. He wanted to start his own business. Gabriella admired this about him. He was serious and goal-oriented. However, Sebastian needed initial capital to start, and the bank wouldn't give him a loan, as he didn't have collateral. That's when he suggested getting a loan in her name, using her apartment as collateral. Gabriella easily agreed. Sebastian confidently spoke about how soon they would be rich, and she believed him and signed whatever he needed. Sebastian was over the moon. He dove headfirst into his new business. Gabriella didn't doubt that their life would soon change for the better. They would have a wedding, think about having children. But things turned out differently. One sunny April morning, Gabriella couldn't get out of bed due to a sudden wave of nausea. She felt so sick that it seemed like if she moved, she would throw up. The nausea passed by itself. But the next morning, it came back. That's when Gabriella realized she was pregnant. A chill ran down her spine. Her nose tingled from the approaching tears. A child was something they hadn't planned yet. And there hadn't even been any talk of marriage. But they had a roof over their heads and enough money to live. When Sebastian's business started bringing in profits, things would only get better. They could raise a child. But Gabriella decided not to tell Sebastian right away. She wanted to make sure it was true first. And Sebastian was too busy and preoccupied. Gabriella went to the doctor. The doctor confirmed what she had already suspected. The pregnancy was further along than she had thought. She flew home from the doctor's office, feeling as if she were flying. She prepared a festive dinner, lit candles, because such news was. She waited for Sebastian. He came home looking grumpy and tired, and the news didn't make him happy at all. You understand, he looked into her eyes with an unusually serious gaze. We have to get rid of it. How? Gabriella gasped. It sounded too terrifying. She already loved the baby and even felt that it was a boy. My business is still uncertain, there's little money, and a child is a huge expense and a big responsibility. He'll make us poor, do you understand? We won't make it. Gabriella tried to convince Sebastian. She cried, brought up thousands of arguments, assured him everything would be fine, that they would manage. Eventually, he got angry and left the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Gabriella cried for a long time, left alone. But she still hoped that he would come to his senses. After all, he was so good, caring, and loved her. Sebastian was just scared. He hadn't expected this. He would calm down, think it over, come back, apologize, and everything would be fine. But, as it turned out, things didn't go the way the naive and young Gabriella had imagined. Sebastian didn't return. Not the next day, not the next week, not even the next month. Gabriella searched for him, but all his friends, the ones she knew, just shrugged or mumbled something incoherent. Finally, one of his friends threw at her, in frustration, "Stop looking for him. He's left the city. Where to, I don't know. And no one knows. He borrowed money from people, including me, supposedly for his business, and now he's disappeared. What are you crying for? Be glad such a rotten person is no longer in your life." Gabriella returned home and cried for several hours. She had already suspected that it was exactly like this. Sebastian was a fraud. But deep down, she still held on to hope. So, he wasn't coming back. That was a fact. Which meant, whether she wanted to or not, she would have to get rid of their baby. Because Gabriella couldn't handle it on her own. The hospital gave her bad news. She was too late. "Why are you smiling?" the doctor asked, looking sternly at the somewhat strange patient. "Do you understand what I just told you? You won't be able to have an abortion now." "I understand," Gabriella nodded, stood up, and left the office. The doctor's words strangely made her feel happy. So, the baby, Santiago, would be born after all. And this was such happiness, despite everything going on in her life. It was even terrifying to think about what Gabriella had almost done. She hadn't wanted to, she had been forced to. Gabriella hugged her still completely flat belly tightly. "Don't worry, baby. Everything will be fine with us. Your mom will manage. For you." Gabriella continued on with her life. She worked, began preparing for motherhood, and tried to save a little for the future. Her mood seemed to lift. Thoughts of Sebastian stopped causing her sadness and anxiety. But then, early one morning, they arrived. A whole delegation, 2 men in police uniforms, a stern woman with a notebook and pen in hand, and a young guy holding a thick folder with both hands. They spoke in turns, the woman and the young guy. The policeman stayed silent. Sometimes, one of them would glance sternly at the confused Gabriella. Gabriella understood what was happening, of course. The small, cozy apartment she had once called home no longer belonged to her because Sebastian had taken out a large loan against it and disappeared. Now, the collateral would go to the bank. Gabriella clutched her head. Her heart raced so fast it felt like it would burst from her chest. What would she do now? Gabriella tried to appeal to these people, explained her situation, cried, but she knew it was all in vain. They gave her exactly 1 day to vacate the premises. And the next day, completely bewildered, Gabriella sat in a park near the building where her apartment had once been. Now, it was someone else's property, one she had no claim to. She had nowhere to go. Gabriella had never made close friends. She had no family. No money, no roof over her head, no one close in this big city, or in the world, really. Gabriella cried, not holding back her tears. Passers-by looked at her either with disgust, wariness, or simply ignored the strange girl, hurrying to their own business, indifferent to the sobbing stranger. Only Tobias didn't walk past. He stopped, sat on the opposite edge of the bench, and studied the tear-streaked girl with a careful gaze from his dark gray eyes. "Miss, what happened to you?" he asked, and it was clear from his expression that he cared. Gabriella looked at him. It was then that she first saw the man who would later take 25 years of her life. He seemed very charming to her. He was around 30, about 10 years older than her. He had well-defined facial features, a stylish haircut, smart gray eyes, and, most importantly, a sincere interest in his gaze. Gabriella realized that no one had ever looked at her that way before. "Did someone hurt you?" The stranger continued. "Don't be afraid. Tell me everything. I can see you need help. You do, don't you?" "Why?" Gabriella sobbed. "Why would you care about someone else's problems? Let's say, women's tears have a special effect on me, the man smiled charmingly. Gabriella interpreted that phrase in her own way. She thought this man just couldn't stand seeing a woman cry and immediately wanted to help. So, she told him about Sebastian, about his betrayal, about losing her apartment. She just didn't mention her pregnancy at that time. Well, it seems like you've met a scoundrel, Tobias shook his head. You didn't recognize him because of your naivety. That happens. Listen, it seems you have absolutely nowhere to go? Gabriella nodded sadly. She already understood that Tobias was going to solve her problem. At least for today, she would have a place to stay. She wouldn't have to trek across the city to the station and sleep in the waiting hall. I can't leave you on the street. Tobias didn't take his eyes off Gabriella. His gaze sent shivers down her spine. She couldn't tell if it felt pleasant or scary. They went to his place. Tobias lived in a large house in a suburban neighborhood. Completely alone, as far as Gabriella could tell. This seemed strange to her. Why would someone need such a big house alone? I've always dreamed of a big family, Tobias shrugged. A wife, children, at least 4. For such a family, you need a lot of space. So I made sure to prepare in advance. As soon as my business started making big money, I built this house. I like it here. Yes, it's very beautiful here, Gabriella sincerely admired. It really was. She had only seen such interiors in movies and TV shows about the rich life. Tobias showed her to the guest room, pointed out where everything was, and, apologizing, went to his office to work. Gabriella took a shower, had coffee with cookies, lay down in the soft bed, and watched a few movies on the giant TV that took up an entire wall. It was strange, and it didn't seem real. But here, she felt so good, cozy, and comfortable. Tobias seemed like a noble savior. She felt immense gratitude toward him. If not for him, if not for his kindness, she would be sleeping at the station tonight. Though, maybe she still would. Tobias came to her bedroom that night. Gabriella didn't exactly resist, but she showed, of course, that she hadn't expected this. However, Tobias didn't seem to care. Then he fell asleep beside her quickly and soundly. Gabriella lay still, afraid to move, and couldn't calm her shivering. On one hand, what else had she expected? Perhaps this was some sort of payment for a place to stay. On the other hand, the image of the noble savior was irreparably shattered. She wanted to get up and leave, but where to go? It was night. Here, it was warm, safe, peaceful. In the morning, they had a conversation. It happened in the kitchen during breakfast, which the host had quickly prepared. Frozen microwave pancakes, coffee. Tobias seemed to be in a good mood, joking and smiling. Gabriella tried to keep up. After all, what else could she do? Plus, she was really hungry. You're very beautiful, Tobias said, sitting next to her. He didn't take his attentive eyes off her. I admired you last night. Every minute I could. And today too. Gabriella blushed a little, but it definitely felt nice. You know what? Let's get married. I'm ready to settle down. And you need someone, you're completely alone in this world. But you hardly know me, Gabriella said. She expected to hear anything, but not this. Have you ever heard of love at first sight? Tobias smiled. I've heard of it, but I didn't believe it. But yesterday, I saw you on the bench and knew, it's true, it happens. You captivated me right away, so. What do you think about this? It's all so sudden. Well, life is made up of surprises and coincidences. Tobias put his arm around Gabriella's shoulders. His touch was gentle and warm, but Gabriella didn't feel very comfortable. Yet, she didn't shake off his arm. This was her chance. Her only chance not to become a homeless wanderer, to keep the baby. By the way, it was time to confess the most important thing. Things were taking a serious turn, and her pregnancy couldn't be hidden anymore. Now, Tobias would understand that he was making a mistake offering her his hand and heart. "You don't know something very important about me," Gabriella said, hesitating. "You see, I'm expecting a child, and it's too late for an abortion." Tobias's eyes flashed with anger for a moment. Gabriella noticed how his fists clenched in fury. The revelation clearly had a huge impact on him. An unpleasant one, of course. But the man quickly regained his composure. "This is not a problem for me. I've always wanted a big family. And a father is not someone who impregnates a woman, but someone who raises the child. Your baby will be our firstborn. I'll raise him as my own, and you just need my support. You won't make it alone." Gabriella understood that Tobias was right. "So, what do you think? Will you marry me?" "Yes," Gabriella immediately answered. What was there to think about? They got married right away. Well, not exactly married, just registered. Of course, they both wore outfits suited to the occasion. Tobias wore an elegant men's suit, and Gabriella wore a white floor-length dress adorned with pearls and embroidery, a beautiful and very expensive dress in which the bride felt like a queen. Then came their honeymoon, a vacation on a tropical island. Gabriella, who had never seen the sea, was so overwhelmed with impressions and emotions every day that she fell asleep in the evenings like a baby. Tobias became her guide to this new world, explaining everything in detail and patiently, always showing great care. He often looked at Gabriella with an attentive and admiring gaze, and it seemed that he truly loved her. Tobias never introduced his wife to his friends or relatives, which was strange, but it was clear that he had them. He met with them and spent time with them. When Gabriella suggested inviting them over, Tobias opposed. Why? I've explained this before. There's no need to let outsiders into our life, into our family. I meet them outside the house. That's more than enough. Gabriella now knew that Tobias had grown up in a wealthy family. His father was a businessman, and the business passed down to his son. The head of the family had passed away unexpectedly, and his heir was barely 20 at the time. Of course, Tobias wasn't ready to take over his father's business. He had to gradually get involved, and of course, there were losses along the way. For a while, Tobias thought he wouldn't manage. But he succeeded. He persevered and even began earning more than his father had. This story, of course, commanded respect. Gabriella also learned that Tobias didn't remember his real mother very well. He was a teenager when she died, and they had stopped communicating even earlier. I was about 9 when they diagnosed my mother with a serious mental illness. My father put her in a closed psychiatric facility because she could have been dangerous to herself and others. I never saw her after that. But soon after, Tobias had a stepmother, Teresa Ramos. However, this woman had left his father many years ago, just before his death. Still, Tobias considered Teresa his mother. She lived in the capital, but they often spoke on the phone. Gabriella also occasionally spoke with her mother-in-law, even via video calls. But Tobias was always present during those conversations. It was important for him to monitor Gabriella's communication with his stepmother. Teresa was a cheerful and kind woman, and she always looked at Tobias with a sense of pity and concern. It was the typical look of a loving mother. Teresa had her own life. She had moved to the capital many years ago and started her own business. She opened a cafe, and now she had an entire chain. After her breakup with Tobias's father, she remarried and had a daughter. The woman appeared to be quite happy. She said many nice and important things to Gabriella and gave her advice. Gabriella felt so warm and comforted by her communication with this lovely woman. Teresa quickly became someone very close to Gabriella, the only person she truly communicated with besides Tobias. Tobias lived quite a reclusive and isolated life. No, he had friends, but they never came over to the house, and he preferred going to events and birthdays without his wife. Well, you won't enjoy it there, no need to waste time. And I'll have to focus on you instead of socializing with my friends. I can't leave you alone. Gabriella nodded, agreeing. She knew she couldn't argue with Tobias, it would be worse for her. She didn't feel she had the right to either. After all, he was her benefactor. He had taken her off the streets, even with her pregnancy. He had given her a beautiful home and supported her financially. Gabriella never lacked money now, she could buy whatever she wished. So why would she raise any complaints? Tobias clearly saw Gabriella as his possession. It was evident in his actions, words, and even his expressions. But at the same time, he admired her. He often gazed at her and was ready to fulfill any of her desires. By which, of course, he meant buying his wife whatever she wanted. What good was equality in relationships, like with Sebastian? Look how that ended. So Gabriella was quite content with the situation. Her child, her beloved and long-awaited baby, would have everything he needed and more. Gabriella was sure she was doing the right thing. Fate had given her a gift. How could she refuse something like this? Where would she be without Tobias? So Gabriella considered herself lucky. She didn't change her mind even after Tobias hit her for the first time. This happened after Gabriella tried to argue with him. He was getting ready for a corporate event, and Gabriella said that she should go with him as his wife. She was tired of sitting at home and wanted something new. She confidently declared that married men should attend official events with their wives. She even said it defiantly. Tobias turned around and slapped her hard across the cheek, so strongly that Gabriella lost her balance and fell to the floor. She thought that Tobias would be scared and apologize. But instead, he came over and slapped her again. Even harder. Her cheek felt like it was on fire. "Don't try to teach me how to live," Tobias said angrily. His eyes were filled with an unpleasant, fiery glow. He did it again, hitting his terrified wife. When her tears finally burst out, a look of satisfaction appeared on Tobias's face. He clearly enjoyed seeing his wife frightened and crying. It was then that Gabriella probably understood the true meaning of his words. The ones he had said to her when they first met. "I have a special relationship with women's tears." They seemed to bring Tobias pleasure, which is probably why he couldn't just walk past the sobbing girl in the park. Before the birth, this had happened only once more. Gabriella began behaving more carefully, trying not to upset her husband, avoiding giving him a reason. But one day, he just snapped. After speaking to someone on the phone, having an argument, it seemed, he stormed into their bedroom and beat his wife. Tobias clearly enjoyed the process. Gabriella tried to protect her belly with her hands. It hurt, and she was scared. But the most important thing was that the baby shouldn't be hurt. The next day, Tobias gave her a gold necklace. It probably cost a fortune. Gabriella put the expensive gift away. It would be her fallback for the future. She would leave Tobias as soon as she recovered after giving birth to her son. And then, she would need money. But for now, she couldn't do that, because her baby was about to be born, and she had nowhere to go with the newborn. She had to endure a little longer. When the time came, Tobias drove his wife to the hospital. It was some strange place. First, the gray two-story building was located outside the city. Second, the bars on the windows and barbed wire on top of the high fence made her uneasy. Moreover, there were no other expectant mothers there besides Gabriella. However, the delivery room was equipped with the latest technology, comfortable and full of all kinds of devices. "This is the best place you can find in our city," Tobias assured her. "Everything will be fine." Gabriella remembered little from that moment. In the delivery room, they gave her an injection, and then she drifted off to sleep. When she woke up, they told her everything. "There were serious complications during labor," said the older female doctor, looking Gabriella in the eyes. "Heavy bleeding. Also, the baby got stuck in the birth canal. We tried everything, did all we could, literally pulled you back from the brink, but the baby, we couldn't save him." Gabriella screamed at that point. The orderlies rushed in, restrained her. A nurse injected her with a tranquilizer. Gabriella's mind was instantly clouded, dulling her senses. But it still hurt. It hurt so much that living became difficult. But it's for the best. If the baby had survived, he would have been severely disabled. Why would you want to suffer with that? The doctor sat next to her, continuing to speak, trying to calm Gabriella. Disabled or not, but it was still her Santiago. Gabriella loved him as he was, in any form, and now he was gone. It was just unimaginable. But that's not all, the doctor continued. During the operation, we had to remove everything, so you won't be able to become a mother again. But you can always adopt a child from an orphanage. There are plenty of abandoned babies. The second piece of news didn't have much of an effect on Gabriella. Well, she wouldn't have any more children, and that was fine. Anyway, those other children wouldn't be the same boy she had loved and waited for all those months, the one she couldn't even hold in her arms. Gabriella spent several more weeks in the strange hospital. She needed to recover from the major surgery. Most of the time, she was kept on heavy tranquilizers that dulled her senses. Tobias visited her every day, bringing flowers, fruit, and candy. He was her only close person and supported his wife. He said comforting words to her, looking very tender and caring, so Gabriella looked forward to his visits. She needed to feel someone's support and care, and it seemed that Tobias was deeply concerned about what had happened. Tobias had often said that he dreamed of being a father of many children. He had waited for this firstborn, Santiago, even though he understood that the baby wasn't his. But he had prepared, even read books on parenting. So, this was their shared grief. Gabriella didn't leave her husband as she had planned before the birth. She stayed with Tobias. She wouldn't have survived alone at that time. And then, somehow, she got used to it. So, 25 years passed, a quarter of a century. Gabriella lived like a bird in a golden cage. She had everything: money, beautiful clothes, dinners and lunches at restaurants, trips with her husband to luxurious resorts. Gabriella didn't work. She never liked the profession of a sewing machine operator, and she was never good at it. So, Gabriella dedicated herself completely to the garden in front of the house. She grew delicate and exotic plants, decorated the grounds, and took care of the trees. She even talked to them, her green wards. Seeing his wife's passion, Tobias organized a home greenhouse for Gabriella so she would have something to do during the cold season, when the trees in the garden stood bare and lifeless. He had really studied his wife well. It seemed as though Tobias could predict her mood and, most frighteningly, read her mind. Was Gabriella happy? No, of course not. First, she mourned the motherhood that never came to pass, though not as deeply as right after the tragedy, yet the sorrow still lingered. Secondly, Gabriella felt lonely, disconnected from life, the world, and other people. She had no friends. It wasn't as though Tobias forbade her from socializing, but somehow Gabriella became isolated in her beautiful home. Tobias, of course, also contributed to this indirectly. So, it happened that Gabriella never made close friends. She only maintained a relationship with Teresa, her mother-in-law. They occasionally video-called each other. The kind woman was very sympathetic toward Gabriella, tried to cheer her up, and comforted her as best she could. Perhaps Teresa could be considered Gabriella's only friend, if one were to define friendship and communication by occasional calls once a month. But it was all under Tobias's watch. Tobias. Gabriella often wondered if he truly loved her. Her husband frequently told her she was beautiful, even years later, when the charm of youth had given way to her mature beauty. Tobias admired his wife's appearance. He ordered portraits of her, wrote her poems, predicted all her wishes, always asking in advance what she would like for a gift on holidays. But did he love her? On one hand, Tobias cared for Gabriella. He was the one who took her off the streets, the one who stayed by her side and supported her after the terrible tragedy. But did a loving person behave like this? Tobias often resorted to physical force. Sometimes, a minor irritation would trigger his fury. It happened suddenly and unexpectedly. His eyes would flare with malice. He would look at Gabriella as though she were the most disgusting and worthless being on the planet and strike her. He hit hard, painfully, and skillfully, ensuring there were no visible marks. Sometimes, he would wake her up in the middle of the night, drag her out of bed by her hair, and it would begin. Not just fists, but also insults, cruel and filthy, as if Gabriella had done something terribly wrong. For the slightest misstep, Tobias might lock her in the basement for hours. He kept her there without food or water. Once, he even forgot to unlock the door on time. She spent a full day in confinement until he returned from work. He apologized afterward, expressed regret, even cried, knelt to ask for forgiveness, and seemed genuinely sincere. And then there were his mistresses. Gabriella knew this for sure. But she didn't mind. She liked it when her husband was absent. Why didn't Gabriella leave him? She had probably grown used to it. It seemed like two people lived in Tobias. One treated her gently, tried to make her happy. The other ruthlessly beat and hated her for some reason. It was probably because of that first side of Tobias that Gabriella stayed. No, she didn't love her husband, she just got used to living this way. After all, Gabriella had never worked, and she still didn't have her own place to live. Of course, there were jewels. Over the years, Tobias had given her many pieces of jewelry, most of which she didn't even have the occasion to wear, given her reclusive lifestyle. If she sold everything, she could probably get a decent amount of money. But she didn't know how to handle this life on her own. She didn't know anything. She couldn't imagine buying a train ticket on her own or renting an apartment. Her experience of life in the outside world had been the saddest. Sebastian, the first man she met, tricked her, gained her trust, and took away her apartment. It would probably be the same here. Gabriella wasn't suited to living alone. Tobias had told her this many times. Gabriella saw no reason not to believe him, she agreed with him herself. And then, she had the garden and the greenhouse. How could she give all that up? How could she leave? She had put so much effort and love into the plants, they were like her children. She never had real children, and she deeply regretted that. If she had had a child, if Santiago had survived, everything would have been completely different. For her son, she would have escaped this golden cage, stood on her own 2 feet, and even moved mountains. But now, life seemed too empty and pointless to fight for actively. It was bearable, in a way, if it weren't for the accidental conversation she overheard. Tobias came home early that day. He looked somewhat puzzled. Gabriella knew that when her husband was in such a state, it was better to keep her distance. So, she greeted him and went upstairs. Tobias stayed in the living room. Gabriella was about to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a piece of pie from the fridge to have dinner in her room. That's when she heard it. "Mom Teresa, what's wrong with you?" Tobias was saying reproachfully. "You should have gone to the hospital a long time ago, you can't delay this." She immediately realized he was talking to Teresa Ramos. Tobias always called her Mom Teresa. "Do you need any help?" "Of course, you'll never admit it." "What do the doctors say?" "No prognosis?" "These doctors are bad, I'll find others." Tobias's voice sounded anxious. Gabriella grew alarmed as well. She understood something had happened to Teresa. She wanted to call her and find out what was going on. But Gabriella still didn't have her own phone. Tobias had said it was unnecessary. He controlled the timing and frequency of her calls with his stepmother. "I'll come to you." "What? Not needed?" "Oh, fine, later then." "Whatever you say. But I'll definitely find you better doctors. I don't trust these ones." When Tobias hung up, Gabriella took a risky step. "What happened to Teresa?" she asked. Tobias might not have liked that his wife overheard him, but this time, he answered reasonably. "Yes, she was taken to the hospital." Some serious kidney disease. Very serious. The doctors don't even make any predictions. Tobias looked scared. Gabriella even felt sorry for him. There was something good in him, after all, the way he cared for his stepmother, the woman who had raised him. "Can I talk to her?" Gabriella asked. "No, it's not necessary right now. She's very weak, and they just performed surgery. There are still many difficult procedures ahead of her. She's not able to handle that right now." Gabriella felt her heart tighten. If Teresa didn't make it, she would be left with only Tobias, unpredictable and probably unhealthy. Teresa, her kind words, her warm smile, it all meant so much to Gabriella. She wanted to support the person who, it seemed, was now almost between life and death. But Tobias was against it. "It's none of your business," he muttered. "Go to your room." Gabriella obediently went to the bedroom, but for the first time in probably 25 years, she decided to do things her way, as if she had woken up. Teresa might not survive. And Gabriella had never even seen her. She had never met the person who meant so much to her. No, this wouldn't do. Gabriella knew Teresa's address. She didn't have a phone, but she had the address. She had seen it once in her husband's notebook, left on the coffee table, and without even knowing why, she had taken a photo of the page. Gabriella was going to the capital, find out which hospital Teresa Ramos was in, meet her, and tell her personally how much she meant to her. Surely, for someone seriously ill, this would be important. And also, perhaps Teresa needed care. Gabriella was ready to help her, day and night, because that's what real friends do. They stand by each other in difficult times. As usual, Tobias left for work in the morning. Left alone, Gabriella immediately began to carry out her carefully planned course of action. She had money, her husband never skimped on it. But it was better to take the cash out of the bank. Of course, Tobias would block the account as soon as he found out what his wife had done. So, she had the money. In fact, she had even bought a train ticket. It had been a bit tricky the night before, but Gabriella had figured out how to use the online ticketing system. She had thought of herself as totally disconnected from life, but it really wasn't that hard. By the way, Gabriella had even booked a hotel room. That worked out too. Now, she just needed to pack her things for the journey. This, of course, had to be done while Tobias wasn't around. Right now. Gabriella tried not to think about the consequences. Of course, Tobias would be angrier than ever, but what would he do to her? Would he kill her? No, he'd probably just beat her again. Maybe lock her in the basement for a day. Take away her money for a while. But Tobias would never get rid of his favorite possession, his toy. Gabriella would endure it. The most important thing was to meet Teresa, tell her the important things, and maybe even help her in some way. Gabriella entered her husband's bedroom. It was here, in his corner wardrobe, that the travel suitcases were kept. She needed to pack. Gabriella decided to take one of Tobias's small, old suitcases, the one he used for short business trips. Light, compact, but still spacious enough, and it even looked nice. Stylish, elegant. She placed it on the floor and opened it. The suitcase was almost empty. As she opened it sharply, a photograph flew out from a pocket on the lid and gently fell to the floor, face down. Gabriella picked up the photo and froze. The image showed a young woman dressed in fashion from about 30 years ago. Well, it was just a photo, right? But Gabriella stared at the face in the picture and couldn't believe her eyes. The woman looked like her, almost identical. The same eyes, the same nose, full lips, even the same hair color. Gabriella felt as though she was looking at herself. But she had never worn that hairstyle or dress. Of course, if you looked closely, there were some differences, but the resemblance was still striking. Gabriella realized that this was no coincidence, and she carefully placed the photo in her handbag. For some reason, she decided that Teresa could shed light on this situation. And she also realized that she would never step foot in this house again. There was no turning back. And now Gabriella was in the capital. She went to Teresa's address. The housekeeper told her in which hospital and ward Teresa was. Gabriella immediately took a taxi and rushed there. Now, standing at the door of the required room, Gabriella was about to meet for the first time in her life the person who meant so much to her. Of course, Gabriella was nervous. What condition was Teresa in now? Would she be happy to see an unexpected guest? Teresa was an important person in Gabriella's life, but did she hold the same importance for her as she did for Tobias? Besides, Gabriella had questions, many questions. And Teresa could have the answers. It was impossible to ask her those questions with Tobias around. But now, they could talk, finally, without his control and supervision. This was all very exciting, even scary. But Gabriella hadn't come all this way just to stand at the door. So, she took a deep breath and stepped decisively into the room. Finally, Gabriella saw Teresa, not through the laptop screen. Pale, gaunt, clearly very ill. But the woman smiled warmly, just as she always had, at her unexpected visitor. At first, Teresa's eyes lit up with joy at the reunion, and only then did confusion and even worry appear. How did you get here? Did Tobias really let you come? No, I came by myself. Teresa's expression changed. Isn't that dangerous for you? Tobias doesn't like it when people go against his will. And he'll probably be upset when he finds out we spoke without him. Tobias has a thing about this. Everything will be fine, Gabriella smiled. She realized she couldn't live like she had before. All these years, it was as if she had been asleep. A difficult childhood, Sebastian's betrayal, the tragedy with her child. So much had fallen on her, so young and inexperienced, practically all at once. But now, Gabriella felt as if she had woken up. And that photograph, the one with the girl who looked so much like her. There was a mystery here, a scary and unpleasant one, it seemed. And Teresa could shed light on all these secrets. But they needed to talk, of course, not under Tobias's watch, but in private. I want to know what's going on. What's up with Tobias? Why is he like this? Gabriella took a deep breath. But first, tell me, how are you? How's your condition? Do you need any help? After all, the initial reason for Gabriella's escape from home had been to meet the only close person in the world, the one who, judging by what Tobias had said, was on the verge of death. Well, things aren't too good with me, Teresa didn't try to sound brave. The doctors aren't giving any comforting predictions. Maybe I don't have much time left on this earth. And here's the coincidence. I've been worried about this too. About you remaining completely in the dark. You don't know who Tobias really is, why he chose you, and what it might mean for you. It's a good thing you came by yourself. I have a lot to tell you. Gabriella sat on the edge of Teresa's bed and, for the first time, took her always smiling, kind mother-in-law's hand. Teresa looked at her visitor and began her story. She had met Tobias's father after she was already divorced. Her ex-husband drank, insulted her, and didn't earn anything. So, by the time Teresa met Arturo, she was very disillusioned with men, thinking they were all the same. Then Arturo came along, gallant, courteous, and a wealthy businessman, which was no small matter. Of course, Teresa lost her head over his attentions. And when he proposed to her, she was over the moon with happiness. Yes, Teresa knew that for Arturo, like for her, it was a second marriage. He had a son, 11-year-old Tobias, who had recently lost his mother. But apparently, he seemed almost happy about it. And after learning more about Arturo's family, Teresa understood why. His former wife had developed a mental illness shortly after childbirth. It was hereditary. It might never have shown up if it weren't for the complicated birth process. Both she and the baby miraculously survived. Who knows, but the fact remains. The oddities began immediately after returning from the hospital. At first, it was minor. They just chalked up some of the young mother's actions to the stress of a difficult delivery, lack of sleep, and adjusting to her new role. But then, the woman's behavior became harsh, even cruel. It was as if she had become angry at the whole world. Everyone seemed to her like an enemy. And she turned all her rage and bitterness toward her helpless little son. Arturo, returning home, often noticed bruises on the boy's body. He was always tearful, fear in his wide-open eyes. His wife always claimed that Tobias had fallen, hurt himself, or burned himself by accident. As he grew older, the boy started complaining to his father about his mother. But his wife convinced Arturo that it was just childish fantasies and there was no reason not to trust her. But one day, bruises were found on Tobias's neck. That was when Arturo couldn't take it anymore and set up hidden cameras throughout the house. And the terrifying truth came out. The mother was tormenting Tobias. She would torture the boy until he screamed or cried. And those reactions seemed to give her pleasure, as seen on her face. Arturo immediately put two and two together and realized that his wife was seriously ill. A healthy person wouldn't behave like that. To take care of Tobias, Arturo hired a nanny because his wife was now in a treatment facility. Arturo talked to his son a lot afterward, Teresa sighed. And now, he believed every word the boy said. His mother had been beating him, locking him in the basement all day, starving him, and throwing him out in the cold. This all seemed to bring her pleasure. One can only guess the horror that the little boy must have felt. And no one believed him. The child was left alone with this nightmare. Teresa tried to be a caring and kind figure for him, offering him love and affection, spending a lot of time with Tobias. They went for walks, traveled, talked about everything. Outwardly, Tobias had thawed, but inside, he remained the frightened little wolf. Teresa saw this. She tried to fix the situation, even took him to psychologists. But it was all in vain. Then I started having problems with Arturo. No, he was a good man, but we had different views on many things, and it gradually started to get in the way. For example, Arturo thought that we didn't need more children because Tobias was already traumatized, and adding a younger sibling would just cause stress and jealousy. That wasn't the only reason, though. I met my current husband, the right person for me, and moved in with him. Soon, we had a daughter, a late but dearly loved and long-awaited child. By then, Tobias was already 18. He was studying at a prestigious university and slowly getting involved in his father's business, as he was destined to take over one day. But no one expected that to happen so soon. Teresa and Tobias stayed in touch, and over the years, they had developed a special bond. His stepmother was probably the only person Tobias ever had warm feelings for. She knew most of the important events in his life. Tobias invited Teresa and her family to his first wedding. And when Teresa saw the bride, she was stunned. The girl looked just like Arturo's first wife, Tobias's mother. Even then, Teresa suspected something was off. He and Christina were married for about 2 years. Teresa shook her head. It was exactly the same as with you. We communicated, but always under Tobias's control. The girl quit her job and gave up her friends. Every time I saw her on the laptop screen, I noticed she was becoming more distant. Then Christina just ran away. She broke free from her golden cage, moved to the capital, and started a new life. Christina was strong and educated. She was able to stand up to Tobias. Later, the woman contacted Teresa and told her what life with Tobias was like. He would beat her, lock her in the basement, insult her, shower her with gifts and money, all the while slowly destroying her, gradually turning her into his voiceless thing. And her appearance, you see, was the key. Christina resembled his mother, like 2 drops of water. It was as if Tobias was taking revenge on his mother when he tormented his wife. Teresa wasn't surprised by Tobias's behavior. Deep down, she had always known that this well-mannered and intelligent man was capable of such actions. Tobias had been traumatized since childhood, and that could never be fixed. Christina and I still keep in touch. When Tobias remarried. Here you are. We both noticed how much you resembled his mother. And Christina too. Your behavior was the same. You hardly interacted with anyone, stayed home. But Christina and I didn't think the abuse was continuing. It seemed that if it were, you would have left him. Run away. But you've been together for so many years. I thought Tobias had changed. There were some strange things left, but overall, he had become a good husband. Turns out, no. Why didn't you leave? I got used to it. Gabriella lowered her gaze. I've always been treated cruelly. And Tobias's behaviors seemed almost normal to me. I'm already quite old, it's too late to start over, but I don't want to live like this anymore. You can't live like this, Teresa exclaimed passionately. Tobias, I have to admit, is sick. Now I realize it completely, no normal person would behave like that. You need to stay away from him. I'm sorry, I'm sick myself and can't help you. But Christina can. I'll give you her address. She lives in this city too. She runs her own business, a chain of flower shops. The main office is not far from here. I'll call her now and tell her you'll come. She'll definitely be happy to help. Confused, Gabriella stood at the threshold of a stylish office in a luxurious business center. Just this morning, she had no idea how things would turn out. And now, Gabriella was about to meet Tobias's first wife. Christina looked young for her years, a beautiful, elegant woman. And yes, they looked strikingly alike. Teresa must have warned her already, and the resemblance left no doubts. Without any unnecessary words, Christina approached Gabriella and hugged her tightly. Gabriella understood she had gained another important person in her life. Tears welled up in her eyes. Then they talked for a long time. Tobias had treated Christina the same way many years ago as he did with Gabriella. She had a loving family in her childhood, and she had a good education. She wasn't the ideal victim. Christina ran away from her husband, settled in the capital, and started a business. Later, she married a man who became both her best friend and business partner. Together, they were a force. Christina only realized what real love and healthy relationships were when she was with him. They had a son, and later, Christina found out that her ex-husband had remarried. His new bride looked just like her and like the mother of Tobias, the woman he hated with all his heart. I started following your fate, Christina admitted. No, I hoped that all of Tobias's anger was directed at me, and now he decided to build a normal family, but I was still worried about you. When Christina learned from Teresa that Gabriella's baby had died during childbirth, she immediately knew something was wrong. She began to investigate. My husband and I even hired detectives, and it turned out the baby was alive. Tobias took you to a hospital where everyone was paid off. It wasn't even a maternity ward, just a former isolation ward for the sick. Tobias paid the doctors, and when they arrived, they told you that the baby died, but in reality, your son was alive. They gave him to an orphanage. Gabriella gasped. Everything around her spun, and her temples began to throb. A wave of joy surged in her heart, a feeling she had never experienced before. At the same time, she also felt anger. She had been robbed of the chance to be with her child, to see him grow up. How had her son lived in the orphanage? Gabriella knew that life there wasn't easy. How could Tobias do this to her baby? Your son is fine. Christina took Gabriella's hand and looked her in the eyes. My husband and I found him and brought him to live with us. He grew up with our child, with love. Santiago knows we are his adoptive parents. We told him everything after he turned 20. We decided he was old enough for the truth. But why did you? Gabriella paused. She couldn't find the right words, but Christina understood her. Why didn't we contact you, didn't tell you the truth? We thought it was better this way. What would you have done? You had no money, no profession, no home. You couldn't have survived alone with your son. And if Tobias had taken him in, it would have been dangerous for him. Who knows what he could have done? But you lived together seemingly peacefully and quietly. Well, that's what it seemed like. I'm sorry, I owe you an apology. You had the right to know. I just thought this was the best way. No need to apologize. Gabriella lifted her tear-filled eyes to Christina. You saved my child. You gave him what I probably couldn't have given Santiago back then. Can I see him? Of course, Christina nodded. It's time for you two to meet. Gabriella walked through the high, solid gates surrounding the psychiatric facility. It was a closed institution where Tobias was now located. Gabriella, Christina, and Teresa submitted the necessary requests. Tobias was required to undergo an evaluation by an independent psychiatrist. Christina made sure it was a truly independent specialist, someone her ex-husband hadn't managed to bribe. The psychiatrist diagnosed Tobias with a serious condition that he had inherited from his mother. It turned out that Tobias knew about it and hadn't wanted children. He had lied to Gabriella, telling her he dreamed of having many children to impress her. In reality, Tobias was afraid to continue the family line because he was almost certain that his child would also be sick. He paid doctors a large sum to ensure that not only was her son taken to an orphanage, but Gabriella was also deprived of the ability to become a mother in the future. A monstrous, terrifyingly cruel act. Tobias was taken to the closed treatment facility. Gabriella, as his sole heir, inherited all of his wealth, leaving her rich and independent. And she was happy too. Because Santiago, the child Gabriella had never been able to hold in her arms, was now by her side. Santiago was 25 years old now. A tall, handsome young man, well-educated, well-mannered, and kind. He was happy to meet his mother. His story, of course, was shocking. But he quickly formed a trusting relationship with his biological mother. Gabriella was happy with her son, watching him with awe. Why did you name him Santiago? Gabriella once asked Christina and her husband. I had chosen that name for him when I was still carrying him. He entered the orphanage under that name. The nurse who brought him said that his mother, who abandoned him, wanted it that way. Maybe you said it to someone during labor. Or perhaps you whispered the name in delirium. Anyway, your son became Santiago. You gave him the name. But at least I managed to give him something, Gabriella said bitterly with a faint smile. You still have so much ahead of you. Now, about once a month, Gabriella visits the psychiatric facility where her husband is. No, she doesn't want to see him, but she brings him care packages, his favorite cheese, crackers, and meatloaf. They are still married. Gabriella knows that Tobias will spend the rest of his life in the hospital and die there, just like his mother. This man ruined her life, deprived her of the chance to raise her son and have other children. Gabriella never created her own strong and happy family. But despite this, she felt pity for her husband. He was ill, and at such a young age, he had to face a cruelty that even she, as an orphan, could never have imagined. That's why Gabriella still brought him care packages. It was part of her new life. So bright, so full now, so happy.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.